So the question is, what do we do when our amp sims just sound muddy? We're trying different impulse responses, we're trying different amp models. What do we do? And also, what do we do when our mix is muddy and there's too much of a buildup of low frequency content, no matter what we do with EQ? Welcome to Viewer Questions Answered, episode 39. So before we dive into today's episode, just need to take a sip of coffee. And I also want to say that we live in the absolute best time in history to be a metal or rock musician. And that comes down to the fact that we have these excellent tools known as MIDI drums and amp sims. The trouble is that so many of us make the same mistakes over and over and over again when using these tools. And even though these tools are capable of producing professional results, people rarely produce professional results because, again, we're all making the same mistakes. And that's why I've put together my MIDI drums and amp sims production checklist. In this checklist, I highlight the key areas where most people go wrong so you can steer clear of these issues and get right to producing better results with the MIDI drums and amp sims that you're currently using. The MIDI drums and amp sims production checklist is absolutely free right now, and you can have direct access by clicking the link below in this video's description. All right, so without any further ado, let's dive into this excellent group of questions submitted by my loyal subscribers. And our first question here comes from Mr. Ignazi. Hi, Bobby. Recently, I've received a bass guitar and double bass recording from a collaborator musician of a client. The recording has a lot of hiss due to something related to electronic static or something similar, I suspect. We cannot ask for a re-recording. I can record the whole thing on my own, but the client doesn't want that either. I've tried the Profile Denoiser plugin, low passing, de-essing, saturation, BX refinement. I've succeeded to a certain point, but the integrity of the whole bass tone is gone as the noise is removed. Do you have any advice for this situation? Okay, well, Ignazi, this is a great question, and unfortunately, certain pieces of audio just might have too much noise to be usable. But I have to say this, the one plugin that I have used with great success is the Waves X Noise, I believe it is called. I have it in one of the Waves bundles that I currently own. I'm sure you could purchase the plugin separately or even run a trial of the plugin standalone. So I recommend downloading that plugin, do the trial, and see if it helps with your situation. For some reason, out of all the plugins I've ever used when it comes to getting rid of background noise, I find that one to be my favorite and to work the best. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully the plugin will solve your issue, and please let me know how it works out for you. Thank you for your question. Okay, our next question here comes from Mr. Slurp Beats. My rhythm guitar tracks seem to phase out on top of each other too much, especially when quad tracking. Any stuff that helps? All right, well, Slurp Beeps, I'm gonna make this simple for you. Don't quad track. There you go, there's your solution. I don't know why people are obsessed with quad tracking. Now, don't get me wrong, there are pro producers out there that are huge fans of quad tracking that do it phenomenally. The thing we have to remember is these guys are extremely experienced in the studio, and when you quad track, you have to really make sure your guitars are ultra tight. Now, yes, you might be saying, oh, well, guitar players quad tracked way before Pro Tools and editing and all this. Yeah, but we have to remember, those guitar players were extremely tight. For example, James Hetfield of Metallica, probably one of the tightest rhythm guitar players of all time. That's why his guitar tracks sound that way. Me personally, throughout my own experience, I found that just one tight performance on the left, one tight performance on the right works, and quad tracking does not give me a result that's any bigger. Maybe it might sound a little more cushiony and a little more full once in a while, and yes, I will layer in a third and fourth track and maybe a chorus with a different tone, or maybe just a different guitar overdub in general. But if you're looking for a tight, huge guitar sound, you don't necessarily have to quad track. And let me just say this, if you do quad track, you have to spend a lot of time making sure that your guitars are really tight, because if you don't, you're gonna end up with the issue you just mentioned, this phasing issue. And generally it comes down to performance or lack of editing. So unfortunately, I know that's probably not the answer that you want to hear, but it's the truth. So if you want to stick with quad tracking, spend a lot of time editing or making sure you're playing ultra tight. But I recommend giving just dual tracking a try, get one tight performance on the left and right, and I think you'll be good. So let me know how that works out for you, and thank you so much for your question. Okay, our next question is a good one, and it comes from Sam. Hi, Bobby. I've recently been struggling with low frequency buildup with both the kick and floor tom. For a slower, more doomy part, you want a big, thick kick drum sound, but then if you go into that fast double kick part, the bass frequencies easily become overwhelming. Also, when moving to a simpler drum groove after a double kick part, the frequency spectrum often feels empty because the buildup is gone. Oh, I know what you're talking about. I have the same problem with especially the floor tom or toms, where on their own they sound great, but in a more tribal drum part, the low frequency buildup becomes a problem. How do you tackle this? This is my favorite part. Please don't let it be simple volume automation. All the best, Sam. Well, Sam, I know people hate hearing this, myself included when I started out. Simple volume automation is your answer. Okay, let me explain why. We have to think about this logically, right? When it comes to a lot of low frequency information, you're right. If it's a slower groove, there's more space in between the beats, so you can get away with more low end. And if all of a sudden the part becomes busier and the volume is exactly the same, you'll end up with more low end because there's literally more low end happening all at once, especially if they're playing the kick and the toms at the same time. I also want to say this. Now, when it comes to MIDI drums or drum samples versus live drums, you're gonna have to use a different approach. For example, when you're using all live drums, all microphones, no drum samples, this isn't gonna be as much of an issue because when a live drummer plays super fast, I don't care if they're the best drummer in the world, they're naturally gonna play lighter when they're playing a more complex part. So what ends up happening is you have a lot of low end when they're playing a simple groove, and then naturally when they play lighter, you're gonna have less low end because you actually have just less volume in general on your kick drum and even during a fast section on the toms. So what's funny about this is often when you're mixing live drums, you have to do the reverse. You actually have to bring up the volume of the kick and even toms or a blast beat on the snare during a fast, more complicated section when the drummer is actually playing lighter. So you have to do the inverse of what I'm about to explain when it comes to MIDI drums. Now, MIDI drums, the problem with them is they're too perfect, right? Especially if you don't take the time to program them like a drummer would actually play in reality. So I often, when using either drum samples or MIDI drums, do a ton of volume automation to bring down the kicks during a faster section, or if it's a part that's really busy on the toms and there's a low frequency buildup, I'll just use volume automation to cut those sections down. Again, people don't like hearing this because most people, I'm gonna be honest, are just too lazy to use volume automation, but I have news for you. Every great mixer under the sun utilizes volume automation. There's no such thing as set it and forget it in pro production. You have to go in there and use your musical vision and ear to craft something that sounds palatable as a mix. So let me just be ultra clear. Let's say you're using a lot of drum samples in conjunction with live drums, or you're using a MIDI drum kit and you have your kit and your mix sounding awesome when it's a simpler groove and all of a sudden he's playing a blast beat or a fast thing on the toms. Yeah, that's normal for the low frequency to build up, and there's no magical EQ setting or even like multi-band compressor setting that's gonna kind of, solve the issue. You just have to go in there and impart the natural kind of dynamics that a drummer utilizes in reality. So Sam, hopefully that points you in the right direction. Let me know how it works out for you. And thank you so much for your question. Okay, we have two excellent questions here coming from Eric. Let's start with question number one. What specifically should I be expecting when I pay an audio engineer to mix my guitars, vocals, bass, and drums? Just volume level adjustment, EQ, gating, and muting automation? The videos you are posting where you are showing mixing techniques for nudging guitars or cleaning them up are awesome. I want that, but the audio mixing freelancers I have been working with are telling me that they do not do that and that I have to provide them with all the audio files that are already cleaned up. Am I wrong, or are they inexperienced? Okay, well, Eric, this is a great question, and unfortunately, there's not one right answer. I'm gonna explain how I run my business because it's pretty typical, especially when it comes to rock and metal production. If a band is interested in hiring me for a mix and they're asking about pricing, the first thing I do is send out a PDF with my pricing and I explain what they can expect. For me, I charge for mixing and mastering all under one umbrella. And I also include reamping because most people have a lot of trouble recording guitars at home, and often their guitars just have to be reamped to get the tone right at the source. So I include all of that under the umbrella of mixing. And that's very typical for metal producers. I also clearly state in my PDF that if the tracks need editing, I charge an additional fee for editing because editing falls under the umbrella of production. Most pro mixers, you're right, are not gonna spend time editing because they're too busy mixing. Editing belongs in the production phase, not in the mixing phase. So what they are telling you is completely normal. So I highly recommend finding a mixer that's willing to clean up your tracks for a reasonable fee or get used to editing on your own. It's a great skill to learn and it'll end up saving you a bunch of money, especially if you're sending out your tracks to mix. Because I'm gonna be straightforward. I charge a lot of money for editing because it takes a lot of time and a lot of attention to detail. So hopefully that clears things up for you. And his second question has to do with amp sims. With respect to guitar amp sims, I have been using Amplitude 5 on my Mac for a while and the sound is great. What I've been doing is recording 2 mono guitar track DIs for the rhythm guitars, then adding amplitude on each of them. But inside Amplitude, I'm using the feature where you can route 3 different amps, cabs, mics, etc. to stereo. I'm then panning each of those hard left and hard right. And in Logic, there's a way that I believe pans both left and right signals to one side, so I'm doing that. Okay, well, Eric, I'm just gonna cut right in here, and that sounds really way overly complicated, in my opinion. Here's the thing. You're not gonna get a better tone by blending multiple amps together. I'm not saying to not do it, but most people think this is kind of the solution to achieving the tone that they have in their head. I highly recommend keeping things as simple as possible and using just a great sounding amp sim with a great sounding impulse response in mono for your left channel, and then doing the same thing for your right channel. Yes, some of these plugins, you could blend multiple heads and multiple microphones, but you're making things complicated again for no reason. It's sort of the same thing with drums. A lot of times amateur recording engineers will use like 20 different room mics, but they won't mic the ride and they won't mic the China, which I always find funny because it's more important to pay attention to the things that are gonna make a real difference. And in my opinion, playing tight, using a basic, inexpensive amp sim that's light on CPU, along with a quality impulse response, is gonna get you way further along than using some complicated chain and then panning the thing within the plugin. I'm not surprised that you're having issues because that sounds way overcomplicated, again, in my opinion. Because I'm gonna be candid, just reading this, I'm confused with this signal chain, and I've been doing this for a long time, so I highly recommend just keeping things simple, and I think you're gonna end up with a much better result. And if you're looking for an impulse response that sounds decent, I will leave a link below to my free IR. There's a link below in this video's description, just click it, and you'll have instantly great sounding tone. Okay, so I would just like to shout out and thank everyone for submitting this excellent group of questions. Now, if you've submitted a question and I haven't gotten to it yet, just be patient. I will definitely get to it at some point within this series. And again, if you're using amp sims and MIDI drums in your productions and you're not happy with the results, I promise you it's probably not your gear. You're probably just making the same mistakes that we all make. And because of this, you could download my MIDI drums and amp sims production checklist for absolutely free, so you could have clarity and understand where you might be going wrong and where you could be going right, so you can get better results with the tools you're currently using. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. Until next time, happy mixing.